Dark tales for dark nights.
The Wreck. Written by Craig Groshek. Narrated by Otis Gyrie. Daniel and Thomas had been hunting since dawn. They were tired and cold, and had not seen a deer for days. They'd walked for miles following tracks and watched for signs of deer, but they still had no luck. The two traveled further from their cabin each day, hoping their luck would be better. One chilly November afternoon, they had walked deeper and deeper into the forest till they reached a spot they had never seen before. Overhanging pines blotted out the sun, and soon they lost all track of time. Noticing how dark it had become, Thomas said to Daniel, "We've walked far enough for one day. We should turn around now, or we'll be out here all night." "No," Daniel protested. "The cabin is miles away by now, and it's so dark now, I'm not sure where we are. Let's make camp here, and we'll head back in the morning." "No," Thomas replied. "I'm cold and tired, and we've got nothing to eat. You can stay here if you want, but I'm going home." The men had just parted ways, and Daniel had only begun to set up his tent when a piercing screech tore through the forest just a few hundred yards from where they stood. This was followed by a thunderous crash and a deafening thud, which shook the trees about them. Neither of the men had heard anything like it before. Thomas rushed back at once. "Did you hear that?" he cried. "I did," replied Daniel. "What do you think it was?" "I don't know, but I think we should find out." The two headed in the direction of the sounds. Soon they came upon an unfamiliar road. It was made of packed gravel and weaved through the forest. Darkness swallowed the road in both directions. It was dreadfully quiet, and the men were scared. But they did not know where they were, and so walked along it for a while. They had gone only a mile or so before they grew restless. The sun had nearly set by then, and they were farther from the cabin than before. Daniel was very afraid. "Tom," he said, "I don't know about this. We've got to go back." "No," Thomas replied. "You can go if you want. I'm going to see where this leads." And Thomas walked on. Daniel was afraid to go on, but more afraid to go back, and he wasn't sure where he had left his tent, so he stayed with Thomas. They walked a bit further and came upon a great plume of smoke blowing in the wind. They smelled oil. Soon they came around a bend in the road and came upon a most horrible sight. An 18-wheel semi-trailer had lost control on the gravel, swerved from the road and hit a thicket of trees, and was overturned. Thomas and Daniel raced to the driver's side of the vehicle. Daniel slipped and fell, and in horror found himself lying in a stream of blood which ran along the length of the truck. Thomas helped him up, and they hurried on. They found a man, unconscious, pinned beneath the truck. His bearded face was ashen, his hands pressed against the truck, as if he had attempted to free himself. Believing the man to be dead, Thomas and Daniel approached him. Daniel crouched beside the man and leaned in to examine him more closely. Suddenly, the driver awoke with a start and grabbed Daniel by the wrist. The man's hand was cold as ice. He did not say a word, but looked Daniel in the eye. The hunter shuddered. It was decided then that Thomas should run back to the cabin to phone for help, while the other stayed behind. In a moment, Daniel was alone with the dying man. He did not like it one bit. Something about the unfortunate man chilled him, but he could not tell what. But he waited, and still Thomas had not returned, and the driver's condition began to worsen. His face was now bluish, his arm limply slung to his side, and his breathing had all but stopped. His eyes rolled back into his head. Daniel feared he would die in minutes if something was not done, and so he took off running to seek help as well. But first, he took off his bloodied jacket and wrapped it around the man for warmth, as by now he was stone cold. In desperation, the injured driver clutched the jacket in his hands and shivered violently. Daniel ran until he came to the paved road. Luckily, he recognized this as the main road which would lead back to his cabin. He hurried along. By the time he reached the cabin, it was pitch black outside, and he found Thomas sitting on the front step waiting for help. Thomas had called for an ambulance, but so far up in the city, it would take some time for help to arrive. The men decided they would need to help the man themselves, and so they gathered supplies and left again. Though they found the gravel road weaving through the woods as before, and what they swore was the same curve in the road, they could not find any sign of an accident. Shaken, the men continued searching for the better part of an hour with no luck. It seemed the truck and its driver had disappeared entirely. Just then they heard an ambulance in the distance and headed back toward the sound. Soon they were back at their cabin, where they again explained to the police what had happened. In moments, the men were escorting the police and 2 men with a stretcher through the woods to the site of the accident. They came to the gravel road and followed it, and the road came to an end. Confused, Thomas and Daniel looked about, but sure enough, the road stopped, much sooner than it had before. It made no sense at all. Where moments ago it had gone for miles through the forest, there was nothing but fallen trees and brush. The area looked the same, but the gravel path had disappeared. The police officer was visibly upset. "How dare you drag us out here for nothing?" the officer said. "Where is this truck of yours?" "It was here, I swear," Thomas cried. "It was right here." The hunters looked about for a moment longer and had nearly given up when Daniel's feet became tangled in something cold and wet. He fell to his knees and looked down. Horrified, he scrambled back to his feet. There, caught between his legs, was his jacket, covered inside and out with blood. Everyone gathered around the jacket as Daniel turned it over. Thomas cried out, "Would you look at that?" On either side of the jacket, frozen in place by the chilly November air, were 2 bloodied handprints, much larger than any of the men's hands. The truck and its driver were never found, and though they searched for it every hunting season, the gravel road they had walked upon never appeared again. The jacket was taken as evidence, but later returned, and though it was washed and the blood removed, Daniel never wore it again, not even in the summer, for every time he put it on he would feel 2 hands, cold as ice, pressed against his back. Old Tom Comes Home. Written by Craig Groshek. Narrated by Otis Gyrie. Far from the nearest city, nestled in a grassy valley resting between a pair of oak and maple-studded ridges, an old man and his son lived alone on a farm. The boy's mother had died earlier that spring, and neither he nor his father handled the loss very well. The boy, once playful and carefree, was now sullen and withdrawn. The father, formerly a gentle and patient man, at once became bitter and cruel. With no one else to talk to, the following months, especially the dark, cold winter days, were lonely and dreadful. Each night, come supper time, the son turned to his father. "Father," the boy said, "why must we live so far from the city? I'm lonely and would like to meet a friend my own age." His father said nothing in return and continued eating his bread and butter. The old man's indifference weighed heavily on his son. Each day his father treated him this way. The boy lost a bit more of his strength, until he was so feeble he could barely stand. One day the boy did not appear for breakfast or do his morning chores. When the old man noticed this, he flew into a rage, eager to punish his son. Intending to teach him a lesson, he snatched his leather whipping belt from the far wall and approached the boy's bedside. There, he took one look at his son, and he fell to his knees. The boy was white as a ghost. The old man dropped his belt. Its dingy, corroded buckle struck the hardwood floor with a clatter. The old man tipped the boy's chin. At that moment, grief and compassion overtook the old man, and he promised he would no longer be cruel. "My son," the old man said, "we must live here and not the city. I, too, am lonely, but must work this farm to earn our living." His son said nothing in return. The boy just lay there, a whisper of a breath escaping his lips. The old man reached out to touch the boy's hand and found his son's skin as cold as ice. That same day, the old man set out for the city to fetch a doctor. Try as he might, however, he could not find a physician who would travel so far from town to see his son. So the old man packed his things and prepared to leave. Just then a sign caught his eye. "Kittens," it read, "free to a good home." The old man knew just what to do. The boy was still in bed, pale as ever, when his father arrived back from the city with a tiny black kitten under his arm. Upon seeing that cat, the boy smiled and regained much of his strength. After much thought, he named the kitten Tom, after his grandfather. From then on, the boy and his cat were inseparable. "Come along, Tom," the boy would say. "It's time to milk the cows." And Tom would come running, his tail swishing behind him. Wherever the boy went, the cat followed. Things went on like that for some time, until one spring, many years later. Then, in the night, Tom disappeared. The next morning, the old man found feathers strewn about and 3 chickens dead. The old man struggled to retain his composure. He was careful to keep his promise to his son, however, and he kept his temper. "You know, my boy, I love you so, but if he kills one more, the cat must go." The boy listened and nodded. Tom, his gray flecked fur now revealing his age, sat purring in his master's lap. The next night, Tom vanished again. In the morning, the old man again found feathers strewn about and 3 more chickens dead. He took a deep breath. The old man remembered his promise to his son and remained calm. Just then, however, he caught a glimpse of his boy sitting on the porch, the murderous feline sprawled leisurely across his lap. What nerve, the old man thought. Look at him, lying there, his belly full of my chickens, as if not one the wiser. The old man felt his face burning with rage. He approached the boy. "You know, my boy, I told you so," the old man said. "He killed once more. The cat must go." The son did not bother to look up. He simply listened and nodded. Tom sat purring in his master's lap. The next day, while the boy was sleeping, the old man hauled the cat to town, carried him across the river and through the woods. Then he turned him loose and left him there. Tom just sat on his haunches, licked his paws, and watched the old man go. The old man got home just before dark and saw his son sitting on the porch. And there beside him was Tom. The graying cat was napping in the boy's lap as if he'd been there all along. The old man could not believe his eyes. At first he was confused. Then he was angrier than ever. Before long he forgot the promise he had made many years ago. He turned to his son with a scowl. "My boy, that cat must love you so," the old man said cruelly. "But if he kills again, old Tom must go. Drowned in a sack filled with stones, that cat will call the river home." The boy stared at his boots. He listened and nodded. Tom purred and purred. The next day the old man found 9 chickens dead. The old man was furious. He stomped into his son's bedroom, an old burlap sack in hand. Finding the cat asleep at the foot of the bed and wasting no time, he grabbed old Tom, stuffed him in a sack, and drove to the city. There he pulled up alongside the river, found some big rocks, and put them in the sack. He tied the sack, cat, stones, and all, and tossed it in the river. Then the old man turned and left him there. As before, the old man reached home before dark and saw his son sitting on the porch, with old Tom there atop his lap. The old man was stunned. The cat was soaked to the bone and licking its paws, but it was old Tom all right. Cruel old man had seen enough. "My boy, that cat, you must love you so," the old man boomed. "He should be in a sack that's filled with stones. This time, in a hole 3 feet below. That cat will call his gravesite home." The boy listened and nodded. He stroked the cat. Tom purred and purred. The cruel old man determined that the boy kill the cat immediately. He handed his son an axe and sent him to the woods to find a stump. The boy was reluctant, but more than that, he was afraid of his father. So he took the axe, scooped up his cat with a spare hand, and trudged dejectedly into the woods. There he laid old Tom on a stump. Then he raised the axe and let it fall, and with tears streaming down his face, he chopped the cat beneath the eyes. Seeing what he had done, the boy turned pale and walked away, dragging the axe behind him. Back at the farm, the boy found his father on the porch and sat beside him. His father said nothing, but continued rocking in his chair. Minutes passed, maybe hours. They didn't speak a word to each other. Then, suddenly, the boy jumped to his feet and spoke. "Father," he said, "look, old Tom's come home." The old man looked out to the road, and there was the cat, trotting out of the woods and into the drive, the bloody upper half of his head in his mouth, chopped beneath the eyes. The Corpse by Craig Groshek. Narrated by Otis Gyrie. In a tiny log cabin, deep in the woods and surrounded by trees, lived a man and his wife. The small house had but a single door and a small window directly across from it. The couple lived alone there for many years until they had grown old and gray. One day the man, returning in the evening from hunting, found his wife bedridden and dreadfully ill. So sick was she that he could not bear to leave her side, and as they had no neighbors and no doctors for miles, the old man tended to her as best he could, but she did not recover and soon died. The man was overwhelmed with grief, but shed no tears. At this he was ashamed. "Surely it is unkind to not cry for one's wife once she has died," he thought to himself. "Tomorrow," he said aloud, "I shall have to make a coffin and dig her grave, and certainly I will miss her once she is buried and out of sight." The very next morning, the man did as he said. He built his wife a fine coffin and dug a fine grave. Standing over the grave outside, he said to himself, "It is all right. Things cannot be as bad as they seem." And he returned to his cabin. Once inside, the man lifted his wife and laid her in the coffin upon his table and stood over her body. In the waning light he adjusted her hair and bound her wrists with a ribbon, as was custom at the time, and laid her hands across her chest. He looked at her for a moment and missed her dearly. "It's all right," he said again. "Perhaps she has not passed on at all, but is fast asleep." But he looked upon her pale face, and he was certain she had died. Soon the old man finished her coffin, and with a sigh closed its lid upon her. Sinking into a chair beside his wife, he laid his arms upon the table's edge and fell asleep. After some time, he could not be sure how long, there came through the open window a long, wailing cry from deep in the darkening woods, but the old man did not move. Exhausted, and thinking nothing of it, he soon fell asleep again. Just then, another unearthly cry sounded in the woods, now closer than before. The man awoke with a start. "Perhaps it was some animal, or just a dream," the old man said, and he dozed off once more. Some hours later, the old man woke again. He was not sure why, but he felt that somehow the room had changed. He lifted his head from the table and listened carefully. All was silent. Straining his eyes to see in the darkness, he looked toward his wife. He could not see a thing. He waited. Suddenly the table beneath him shook. Too frightened to speak or move, the old man did nothing. Then he heard the sound, ever so softly, of a step, as of feet on the floor beside him. Terrified, the old man rose slowly from his chair and groped about in the darkness. Who's there?" the man asked. Suddenly, something heavy was flung against the table, and the man was nearly knocked to the floor. At the same time, he heard a thump as something was dragged and fell upon the floor. The weight of it shook the small cabin. Stretching his hand across the table, he sought for his wife. The table was empty. The man was terrified. He rose slowly from his chair and asked, "Wife, is that you?" No one spoke, but soon he heard dragging again. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something heavy, which shuffled toward the cabin's window. At that moment, a scuffle broke loose. It seemed something had slammed itself against one wall and then another. Furnishings were overturned, pots and pans thrown to the floor and smashed. The old man felt he would soon go mad. Rushing to the nearest wall, he groped about and seized his loaded rifle and, without bothering to aim, fired it. By the flash which lit up the room, the old man saw a most horrible sight. Across the room, dragging his dead wife by the throat toward the window, was an enormous black creature. It was nothing he had seen before, easily twice the size of any wolf. It glared at him with its yellow, sliver-like eyes, and its fur bristled. In a second, the man fired another shot, and the thing let her go, and sprang from the floor and out the window. Then it was gone, and the old man fell to the floor, unconscious. He woke the next morning. The sun was high, and birds were singing. For a moment, he thought he must have been dreaming, but he rose from the floor and found his table empty, the coffin overturned on the floor. Near the window lay his wife, where the beast, frightened by the gunshots, had left her. Her long hair was tangled and her clothing torn. A great deal of blood, not yet settled, had poured from her throat and pooled. This was not the worst thing he had seen. The ribbon which he had bound her wrists for burial was broken. Her hands, which had been laid flat before and over her chest, were at her sides and clenched tightly. Her eyes were open wide in terror. Beneath her teeth was the creature's ear.
The Face in the Fog, written by Craig Groshek and Jason Roberts. Narrated by Otis Gyrie. Years ago, I lived in a large two-story house that overlooked Pilcha Tree Farm in Arlington, Washington. I owned 50 acres of beautiful land filled with horses and dogs, with my own private 25-stall barn and an indoor area for riding during the winter. I named my equestrian center Dutch Mills Farm because most of my family is from Holland. For 15 years, I lived happily in that home with my wife, earning a living boarding and breeding the horses of the well-to-do in and around town, for a fair price, of course. Unfortunately, all that happiness came to a horrible end as I looked out my bathroom window one foggy, moonlit night. The night it happened, a beautiful full moon illuminated the tree farm next door. The thick layer of fog looked like an enormous white blanket of cotton lying across the top of the trees. As I watched and listened peacefully to the sounds of the rural countryside through my open window, all of that tranquil beauty was interrupted suddenly as a dark shape slowly lifted out of the fog and then slowly disappeared from sight. In the short time it took the shadow to flit in and out of the fog, I didn't get a good look at it, and so I had no idea what it was. It didn't return, and I had a big day the next morning, so I had no choice but to shrug it off. I shut the window, turned in for the night, and forgot all about it. A few days later, I found myself settled down and ready to climb into bed, looking forward to relaxing with the local newspaper and catching up on current events. As I began to peruse the day's stories, my eye was drawn to one title in particular. Authorities continue search for livestock thieves. According to the news report, there had been several incidents in recent days involving animals disappearing, mainly cows, goats, and a few horses. One report mentioned that a cow had been found mutilated in an unusual fashion. Apparently, it had been sawn in half, right down the middle.
After reading the gruesome reports, I started making sure all of my horses were locked away in the stalls at night instead of letting them roam about, and my dogs were locked inside before sunset as well. It was near midnight the next night when I found myself restless and having trouble falling asleep. In no mood to spend the night tossing and turning, I slowly forced myself up and quietly found my way to the master bath, trying not to wake my wife. I grabbed a glass and filled it with water, then fumbled around the top drawer trying to find my sleeping pills. A few minutes later, after swallowing a pill or two, I found myself staring once more at the tree farm, again bathed in a sea of eerie fog. Whether it was because of the recent news reports I had read, or simply because of the remarkably similar weather, the memory of the other night crept back to the surface of my mind. I couldn't tell you how long I stood there, staring, but it was long enough for the medicine to start kicking in. Eventually I decided to go to bed, but then, just as I turned to head out of the bathroom, it happened. The dark shape emerged from the fog. I watched with a combination of dread and fascination as the shadowy figure rose above the quilt of fog. It looked like a human head. No torso, no appendages. Just a bulbous head hovering in the fog. It must have been the size of a car. I squinted my eyes in an attempt to get a better look, but the medication made it hard to focus. I thought I could make out some features. It seemed feminine in a way. A moment later, I froze in my terror. My God, it was staring directly at me. But the next thing I knew, everything went black. By the time my wife discovered me lying unconscious in the bathroom, it was early morning, and the sun was just beginning to peek over the tree line. As I came out of my medication-induced haze, I became aware that I must have completely destroyed the glass I had been drinking from the night before. Dozens of jagged shards littered the tile floor. Then, just as I began to consider how lucky it was that I hadn't cut myself, the events of the prior evening came creeping back, and soon I remembered what I had seen. I dared not tell anyone. Besides, it may have been nothing more than a hallucination, the impossible apparition, a product of my medication. I rationalized that everything I'd witnessed had been my imagination, not some giant monster roaming the nearby forest. In the end, I decided not to share my experiences with my family or friends. They never would have believed me anyway. Later that same evening, however, the fog rolled in yet again, a recurring reminder of the things I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. As I lay in bed, my curiosity began to grow. Until at last it threatened to consume me. I had to be sure, had to confirm that the ghastly apparition was nothing more than a byproduct of my medication, and not something else. Instead of popping a pill that night, I grabbed my camera and made a commitment to wait until midnight in order to satisfy my curiosity. If the thing I'd seen was indeed a hallucination, resulting from my daily cocktail of exhaustion and drugs, the truth would soon become clear. And if it was still there, well, I preferred not to consider that. When the appointed time came, I got out of bed and grabbed my camera off the nightstand beside my bed. I made it to the window without incident and raised the camera to eye level, prepared to document my findings, or lack thereof. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the rise and fall of my wife's chest as she slept heavily. In a way, I envied her.
As far as sleep was concerned, she was my polar opposite. Whereas I couldn't sleep a wink without a sleep aid in those days, there was a good chance she could nap through a hurricane and literally depended on me to wake her in the morning. I sighed and turned back to the task at hand. That night, the previously full moon was waning, and as a result, it was much darker than it had been on previous nights. The thickest fog I'd seen in years complicated things further, but in spite of the reduction in visibility, the moon still cast enough light for me to see for some distance. So I stood there, like a sentry guarding a frontier outpost, waiting for something, anything, to happen. I waited for over an hour without spotting anything out of the ordinary. It's then that I began to feel like an idiot. What on earth am I doing? I thought to myself. I ought to be in bed getting some much-needed sleep, not staring at a deserted stretch of forest. Resigning myself to the fact that my medication was far too strong and causing me to see things, and making a mental note to speak with my doctor in the morning about switching prescriptions, I put the camera in the bathroom drawer. That way, I wouldn't need to explain to my wife what I was doing with a camera in the middle of the night. Then I closed the drawer and took one last look out the window, and I froze. My blood turned to ice in my veins. My heart leapt into my throat. I couldn't breathe. No, it couldn't be, I thought. It isn't possible. Hovering above the fog, a monstrous face stared at me, its large orb-like eyes gazing directly into mine while it emitted an unsettling, monotonous humming sound. A palpable dread overtook me. I'd never been so afraid in my life. I'd seen that look before, upon the visage of a feral cat as it eyes an unsuspecting squirrel. Then, seemingly out of nowhere and quite unexpectedly, the face, which still to me resembled a woman's, actually smiled at me. A smile so sincere that, had it not been for what it did next, I might have admitted to being a poor judge of character and called it benevolent. In moments, the smile faded from the thing's face as it first parted its lips and then began licking them. The way it swayed and hummed, like the low-pitched whine of the wind passing through hollow reeds, was so hypnotic, almost sensual, that I didn't notice at first when it began salivating. I stared for what I am sure was only moments, but felt like hours, before I realized there was more to it, her, than just a face. Below its fantastically enormous head, it had several twisted arm-like appendages. At the end of one of these, clutched in what can only be described as a horribly disfigured hand, was a fully grown cow. As I watched the morbid scene, spellbound, it brought the animal to its gaping mouth. All the while, the cow strained against its captor, struggling to escape, and made the most horrible sounds I've ever heard escape from a living thing. Unbelievably, my wife slept through the whole thing. Then, as quickly as the monster had appeared, it bit the cow in half and swallowed first one end of it, then the other without chewing. I vomited over and over again, heaving and retching until my stomach ached. When the pain finally subsided, I rose fearfully and gazed out the window, praying that it would be gone, but it wasn't. As I watched in horror, the thing parted its gore-soaked lips, exposing row upon row of serrated razor-like teeth, and lapped up the rivulets of blood streaming down its vile face, humming and swaying all the while in its sickeningly seductive way.
Then, as quickly as it had come, it vanished into the same fog from which it had emerged. When I emerged from my stupor several minutes later, I realized I hadn't taken a single picture of the thing. I hadn't even attempted it. I cursed myself silently while I checked to make sure all the doors and windows were locked and all the shades drawn, then inhaled a couple of sleeping pills and collapsed on the downstairs, blacking out until dawn. The next day, I investigated the area where the monster had appeared, half expecting to find that my experience had been a dream. Near the tree line, however, exactly where the thing had appeared the night before, there was evidence to the contrary. Enough congealed blood, along with fragments of bone and matted, oily tufts of black and white fur, to convince even the most stalwart city dweller that the gruesome remains before them had once belonged to a cow. I made plans to have my horses moved immediately, and I found a place for my wife and I to rent until I could sell our property. I rushed my wife into a cheap motel in town, several miles away, with only the briefest of explanations, simply showing her the newspaper article about the livestock disappearances and telling her I saw a large pack of wolves outside our window the other night, and I was certain they were responsible, and we were going to come after our horses next. She bought it, thankfully. I made the decision to stay at Dutch Mills Farm one more night. To this day, I don't know why, but I felt utterly compelled to see the thing again, to get a picture of it. I needed proof. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted to see it sway and hear it hum one more time. Just one last time. Once more, I took a pass on my sleeping pills and waited near the window until midnight, camera by my side. For hours I waited patiently, fully expecting to see it raise its head out of the fog in preparation for another grisly display, but nothing happened. Disappointed, but remaining vigil, I went to bed with the only gun I owned under my pillow, and I slept fairly well, knowing I had a loaded weapon mere inches from my face and that my family was in a motel miles from there. The next morning I awoke to the familiar sound of birds chirping, of leaves rustling in the trees. I stretched, got up, got dressed, and walked over to the large bedroom window and opened the curtain, where I expected to see the usual panoramic view of the neighboring tree farm, with the blue sky overhead and green trees as far as the eye could see. I instead found myself staring at a pair of lip prints, about 4 feet across, on my window. Failing to realize what it all meant at first, my thought at first was that it looked like dripping lipstick. But I knew better. As I looked closer, my fears were confirmed. The lip prints were made of blood. The blood of what or whom, I hope I never find out. As abhorrent as the scene was, I couldn't take my eyes off of it. I stood transfixed, staring for what felt like hours, and then another realization hit me. The bloody prints were not on the outside of my window. They were on the inside. The message was clear. This thing, she, was inside my house while I was sleeping, under the influence of sleeping pills and unable to be roused, and could have done worse to me than she did to the cow. Whether the bloody prints were a threat or a goodbye kiss, I will never know. I didn't want to find out. That same morning, I cleaned up the bloody mess, packed up, and hightailed it. I never looked back, never did get to take a picture, and never got the proof I thought I wanted. Not that I needed any. I never did tell my family, friends, or the police about any of what happened.
They would sooner have me institutionalized than take my word about something so unbelievable. And I stopped taking my medication. I simply couldn't handle the thought of something creeping up on me again while I sleep. And I have alarms on all of my doors and windows. It took some time to convince my wife of the need when she had no idea what had happened to me, but I can be persuasive when I mean to be. All things considered, however, it's not the lack of evidence or closure that bothers me most, to this day. The second-floor bedroom window in my new home also overlooks a field, which until this past week had provided a wonderfully scenic view of a nearby river and an oak and maple-studded forest beyond. What bothers me most these days is that on certain foggy nights, when I can't sleep and refuse to take a sleeping pill again, I can't help but go to the window and keep vigil. And on some of those nights, when the beautiful full moon casts its glow upon the wilderness beyond my yard, when the thick layer of fog again resembles an enormous white blanket of cotton lying across the top of the trees, I watch and listen, and I swear I can make out dark shapes hovering quietly in the gathering mist, watching me before they disappear into the forest. And most nights, I can make out the faintest humming sound carried upon the breeze, like the low-pitched whine of the wind passing through hollow reeds.
The Boggart by Craig Groshek. Narrated by Otis Gyrie. There had never been as hard-working a man as Bradley Edwards. As a farmer, he lived off the land, and he lived within his means. He had a beautiful home, a fine wagon, a pair of prized stallions, and a loving family. But Bradley Edwards also had a problem. A Boggart had decided to move in with his family. At first, there began a series of annoyances. Because no one could see the Boggart, Bradley's wife and children suspected each other. The children squabbled when something went missing or a toy turned up broken. Soon, however, the Boggart became bolder. Salt and pepper shakers tipped over during dinner. Pots and pans clanked and clattered at random. The children often awoke to something pulling off their sheets. They left doors open, then returned and found them closed and locked. Windows opened without explanation. While Bradley's family did not know what to make of these strange occurrences, he knew exactly what the trouble was. Years back, a Boggart tormented one of Bradley's neighbors. After enduring its trickery for months, the poor man and his family moved away to rid themselves of it. Bradley figured this must have done the trick, because his neighbors did not return. But he was not about to leave his home behind now, despite his wife's insistence. He had built his home with his own two hands. No, he thought, he would not leave it behind over a few silly pranks. "We have it good here," he told his family over dinner one evening, just as the Boggart finished spilling their milk and smashing their butter. "Maybe this thing, whatever it is, likes all the attention. Let's ignore it and see what it does." Things were calm for the next week or so. For a moment, Bradley deemed his plan a success. Then one night, he woke suddenly to the sound of his children screaming and crying. Bradley and his wife threw on the robes and ran to their aid. They found bedsheets strewn about, curtains open, and their shaken, panic-stricken children huddled together. Though the room was now quiet, echoing in the hollows of the house between the timbers and under the hand-hewn floorboards, Bradley heard laughter. Sinister, mocking laughter. He decided to pay it no heed. Instead, he helped straighten the bedsheets and close the curtains. The oldest, a boy of 12 years of age, explained that their curtains had begun to shake and had opened on their own. When he rose to check for a breeze, he said his younger siblings began screaming. He looked back and witnessed their bedsheets twisting and turning to engulf them and suffocate them. When he rushed back to help, a clammy, invisible hand seized him by the throat, threw him to the ground, and pressed him there. He felt an icy weight upon his chest, pressing the air from his lungs. He struggled to breathe. When he finally found the strength, he let loose the blood-curdling howl that awoke his father. The next morning, Bradley's sons deemed that everyone pack and leave immediately. "Nonsense," he replied. "This is our home and our land. We will not be driven out." "But father," the boys protested. Bradley shushed them. "Enough," he said sternly. "There shall be no more talk of leaving this place. If anyone is to be quitting this homestead, it is the blasted thing which torments us." With that, Bradley cursed the Boggart and decided that everyone was to continue ignoring its dreadful antics. For a while, this seemed to have some effect. For the next week or so, the Boggart seemed to lose much of its strength. It occasionally rapped on the walls, broke a dish, or scattered the dirt Bradley's wife had swept carefully into piles, but it had not attacked or injured anyone again. In fact, the children became comfortable enough with the Boggart that they began to play a game with it. They put objects atop the stairs and let the spirit roll them back down to them. This was great fun for the three sons, and they began to question whether they had been too hard on their mischievous guest. A week passed with little activity. Then one night, shortly before dawn, Bradley woke again to the screams of his youngest children. He and his wife again grabbed their robes and dashed to their rescue. Once in their children's room, they saw a most horrific scene. Suspended in the air, bedclothes wrapped around his throat as a noose, was the oldest son. His face was pale. His eyes were dull. His arms hung loosely at his sides. The younger boys screamed and screamed. Bradley and his wife covered their mouths in horror. Their son was dead. Within moments of their appearance, the Boggart took its leave, and their son's corpse plummeted to the floor. Bradley and his wife ran to his side and held him. They sobbed and shook the boy. He would not wake. Bradley drove his fist into the floor in despair. Just then, echoing in the hollows of the house, Bradley heard laughter. Malevolent, snarling laughter. He cursed the Boggart and resolved then and there to leave the house at once. He would let the horrible specter, or whatever it was, have the place to itself. As Bradley and his family were loading their final belongings into their vehicle and preparing to depart, a neighbor by the name of John Marshall passed by and witnessed the commotion. "Why, Edwards," he declared, "what's got you folks leaving in such a hurry?" "I've got no choice," Bradley said, mopping the sweat from his brow. "This monstrous Boggart has been playing tricks. It killed our oldest just before daybreak." John Marshall shook his head. "You're fooling," he exclaimed. "No, sir, and I am not going to wait to see what it does next." With that said, Bradley Edwards and his family got aboard their wagon, turned their horses, and were off. The old homestead was scarcely out of sight when a voice boomed from the rear of the wagon. "Good morning, Bradley," its voice creaked and moaned in the wind. "I thought we'd never leave."
Chilling tales for dark nights.